In the east, we report from a village on the front line where residents live under constant shelling. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Al Jazeera, live from Doha. Also coming up, another deadly attack in Afghanistan. An explosion in a Kabul mosque killed at least 10 people. Record heat waves across Pakistan and India. New Delhi swelters in the second hottest April in 72 years. And former tennis champion Boris Becker is handed a 2.5-year prison term for hiding millions of dollars from bankruptcy investigators. Russia's military campaign in Ukraine is now mostly focusing on the eastern industrial heartland. Kyiv says Moscow has intensified its offensive. There's been fierce fighting in the Donbass region, with the Russian military taking these two towns. They're also heading towards Lyman and Poposhna, two cities being defended by Ukrainian troops. Richard Stratford sent this report from Marinka, a village now on the front line of the war in the east.
92-year-old Raisa is blind, infirm and terrified. She sits crying on her bed in this makeshift shelter. Shrapnel from a shell ripped through her leg while she sat at home in the eastern Ukrainian city of Mariinka.
Thank God we're alive. They shell every half an hour. Shrapnel hits everything. We climbed out of the rubble, grabbed what belongings we could, then lifted Mum out. We found a wheelbarrow and put her in it and pushed her to the road, where a volunteer rescued us.
In a nearby village, people wait at a food distribution point. Many have either fled or been rescued from the shelling in Mariinka. A volunteer from a church group hands out plastic bags filled with a few essentials. Ludmila shows us what's inside.
We live off canned food and what we can grow. We have no money because we can't work. We can't work anymore. This is how we survive.
Further towards Mariinka, as the sound of shelling echoes across the fields, signs of the fighting begin to appear. Houses badly damaged and abandoned, a school destroyed. We drive further and into Mariinka. There's the sound of artillery fire and occasional small arms fire. Russian forces are close. We've been hearing what sounds like mortar fire in the center of the city. What we do know is that Russian forces control positions just a few hundred meters in that direction on the other side of the river. Another shell there. Now, we also know that the Russians made gains here in Mariinka at the early stages of the war. The Ukrainian army have since said that they have now pushed them back. We move back out of town and see black smoke rising. Olena helps her wounded mother into a taxi to take her to hospital. It's doubtful Raisa will ever see her home again. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, Mariinka, eastern Ukraine.
Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the situation in the Donbass region and the city of Kharkiv has been challenging, but his forces are fighting back.
The situation in the Kharkiv region is difficult, but our troops and our intelligence have important tactical success. The occupiers are doing everything to destroy any life at the Donbass territory. Constant cruel bombardments, constant Russian strikes on infrastructure and residential areas state that Russia wants to make this territory uninhabited. That's why the defence of our land and our people is literally the fight of our life.
Meanwhile, Kyiv's mayor is warning another Russian attack on Ukraine's capital could be just hours or days away. And staff with UN chief Antonio Guterres say he came dangerously close to a missile strike while on his first visit to the country since the start of the war. He's now left Ukraine. Abdel Hamid went to the site of Thursday's attack.
You can see behind me the rescue workers and the repair, the emergency service are actually sifting through the rubble. Now, earlier this morning, they did find the body of a young woman. She was a journalist with Radio Liberty. She was buried under this rubble somewhere here in this apartment block, and we are really in the city center of Kyiv. Now, this attack happened just after President Zelensky had wrapped up his meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The first reaction really came because of that missile attack here in downtown Kyiv, with many members of his government and President Zelensky himself again underlying the fact that Russia did not have any respect, in their view, even towards the UN Secretary General, and making a point that this attack was done purposely and was very well timed to coincide with his visit. A lot of criticism ahead of his visit, not only because of the timing and the way he decided to go to Moscow first and come back here, but also because of the role of the UN so far. There's been a lot of frustrations in the weeks leading to the war, and there's been a lot of frustration throughout the war. We're 2 months in, many other leaders have showed up here in Kyiv, and then he comes at the back of it. So certainly a difficult position for the Secretary General, who is trying now to just push forward the humanitarian track.
Russia's defense ministry has, for the first time, claimed to have used a submarine to launch missiles at Ukrainian military targets. On Thursday, the UK's defense ministry warned that Moscow could still reach Ukrainian targets from the Black Sea. That's despite the sinking of its most prestigious warship, the Moskva, earlier this month. Well, the EU has called for restraint after a series of explosions in a Russian-backed breakaway region of Moldova. Kyiv and Moscow blame each other for the incidents in Transnistria. Mead Barker has more from the Moldovan capital, Chisinau.
We're only a couple of hours' drive away from the Ukrainian border, but the situation here in the Moldovan capital, Chisinau, couldn't be more different. The country has taken in more Ukrainian refugees per capita than any other, but given an uptick in violence in Moldova's breakaway region of Transnistria over the past few days, the concern is the war could be moving a little bit closer west. On Monday, Transnistrian officials said that a security service building was attacked with rockets and grenades. On Tuesday, 2 Soviet-era radio masts that provide Russian radio to the breakaway region were destroyed. And on Wednesday, Transnistrian media said shots were fired from Ukraine into a village in Transnistria where there was a Russian arms depot. The region has around 1,500 Russian troops that have been permanently stationed there since the early 1990s in a brief war between Russian-backed separatists in Transnistria and the Moldovan authorities. The Ukrainians have blamed Russia for provocations of staging false flag operations to justify mobilizing troops in the region and possibly a full-fledged Russian invasion from the south. And we're now also hearing that Western intelligence has advised Ukraine about a possible incursion by Russian forces in Ukraine's most southwesterly part, pushing up north into Moldova proper. And given that the country only has 6,000 or so active troops, many here feel increasingly vulnerable.
Moldova's in a really critical situation because Russia's provoking things to stir up a conflict. It's impossible for the Moldovan army in its current state to stand up to Russia. But we're ready because this is our home, this is where we live, this is where our children and grandchildren are.
Look, I've got a military tattoo. I fought in Afghanistan and Transnistria. I was in the army for 11 years, but I will never let my son serve. Can the Moldovan army protect us? You have to be joking.
Historically, the country has been pulled between East and West. Once Soviet, it now aspires to EU membership. But the crisis in Ukraine has complicated Moldova's future.
A powerful blast has hit a mosque in western Kabul during Friday prayers, killing at least 10 people and wounding many others. A spokesman for Afghanistan's Interior Ministry said the explosion happened at the Khalifa Sahib Mosque. It's the latest in a series of attacks targeting places of worship and civilians during Ramadan.
A number of Taliban members were inside the mosque too, and while we were standing to finish our Sufi worship, within a few minutes an explosion occurred, and I was covered with small pieces of victims' body parts.
An ISIL fighter responsible for the beheadings of several hostages has been sentenced to life in prison in the US. London-born Alexander Cotti was part of the so-called Beatles group within ISIL. Hostages gave them the nickname because of their British accents. Cotti pleaded guilty last year to murdering 4 Americans. Patty Culhane has more from the courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia.
Alexander Cotti wasn't the only one of the so-called Beatles in the courtroom. Al-Shafi al-Sheikh had been convicted of similar crimes earlier. The judge wanted them both there so the families wouldn't have to give their victim statements twice. He'll be sentenced later, but for now it was Cotti's turn, and as expected by the plea deal, he was sentenced to life in prison. Now they've made an arrangement so that if he meets certain conditions, he will serve 15 years of that sentence here in the United States, then be sent back to where he was born in the United Kingdom to complete his sentence. Now, the family got a chance to look at the men, describe their anguish. One mother said, there are no words to describe the pain. You have ruined our lives. Others talked about how horrible the uncertainty was of not knowing what was happening to their loved ones and then finding out the absolute horror of the manner of death by beheading. Also their treatment. They admitted they waterboarded their captives. They used stun guns. They beat them severely. But there was another family member who sent a much different message.
You no longer have power over me and mine. I forgive you.
Now, one of the things prosecutors wanted is they wanted the judge to decide just exactly how his prison time in the United States would be spent. They were hoping that he would be put in mostly solitary confinement. The judge said that would not be appropriate for him to rule on that. He'll leave that up to prison officials. He did say that he thought that he showed some remorse, and he did comment on the fact that he has agreed to meet individually with family members in the days ahead. One of the things the families say they still want to know is, in many cases, exactly what happened, how'd they die, and more importantly, where are their bodies so they can bring them home to finally have a proper burial.
Time for a short break here in Al Jazeera. When we come back, we're in Kenya, where herders are struggling to keep their animals alive during the region's worst drought in decades. And we meet Iraq's self-declared living dead. They've lived in the region for centuries, but say they're still treated like outsiders. More on that. Stay with us.
The journey has begun. The FIFA World Cup is on its way to Qatar. Book your travel package today.
Hey there, great to see you. We've got furnace-like conditions across India. This is a scene in New Delhi. Peak heat is still to come, and we won't get relief until June when those monsoon rains kick in. So here's what we're up against. A high of 43 in New Delhi on Saturday, 45 degrees in Nagpur. I want to talk about that active weather. We get our usual storms bubbling up across Sri Lanka into the Maldives, and for India right through Karnataka into Kerala states. But I want to take you to Bangladesh. I think we're going to see some rocking storms here, especially around the capital region, Dhaka, over the course of the weekend. Off to Southeast Asia, we see that rain fill in across Indochina, so some heavier pulses of rain for Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And otherwise, for the rest of Southeast Asia, it's our usual storms coming and going across this zone. We're seeing another batch of wet weather wind up for central and southern portions of China. That's going to slip further toward the south. This is going to have an impact on Hong Kong. Big drop in those temperatures, so just a high of 22 degrees. We're in May by then, so the average, you should be closer to about 29 or 30. The rain has made a clean sweep across out of Japan, so we're back into the sunshine in Tokyo with a high of 20 degrees. That's it. That's all. See you soon.
Qatar Airways, official airline of the journey.
In the Vietnam War, the U.S. Army used a highly toxic herbicide with catastrophic consequences.
Agent Orange was the most destructive instance of chemical warfare.
A decade later, the same happened in the U.S. state of Oregon.
These helicopters flying over the ridge, spraying something, and they didn't even see the kids.
But 2 women are still fighting for justice against some of the most powerful forces in the world. The People versus Agent Orange on Al Jazeera.
Welcome back. A quick reminder of our top stories here this hour. Ukraine says Russia has intensified its offensive in the east. There's been fierce fighting in the Donbas region. Ukraine's president has described the situation there as difficult, but says his forces are fighting back. At least 10 people have died in an explosion at a mosque in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Many more were injured in the powerful blast during Friday prayers. It's the latest in a series of attacks during Ramadan, targeting places of worship. And an ISIL fighter responsible for the beheadings of several hostages has been sentenced to life in jail in the US. London-born Alexander Coty was part of the so-called Beatles group within ISIL. A security guard at an Israeli settlement in the occupied West Bank has been shot and killed. The Israeli military say Palestinian gunmen opened fire in the Ariel settlement between Ramallah and Nablus and then fled the scene. Millions of people in South Asia are struggling to deal with a heat wave that's only predicted to get worse. Power outages in India and Pakistan have made it even harder to cope with record-breaking temperatures. Elizabeth Paran reports now from New Delhi, which has reported its second hottest April in 72 years.
Labourers in New Delhi worked through temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius to construct India's new parliament buildings. Like many street vendors and auto rickshaw drivers here, they make up some of the 75% of India's workforce who work outdoors.
We have to go outside to work. It's very hot. Even the water we carry becomes too hot to drink. We don't even have enough water.
A heat wave has gripped many parts of India for weeks. That's after the nation saw its hottest March since records began 122 years ago. The higher than usual temperatures have led to demand for electricity reaching an all-time high this week and power cuts in several states. Delhi's regional government has told people to expect power outages at metros and hospitals because of a shortage of coal at power plants. The Indian government has cancelled hundreds of passenger trains to rush coal to thermal power plants around the country. The intense heat has also affected wheat crops, with some agriculture experts predicting this year's yield will be 25% less. That could have international implications. India was planning to help fill the gap in global wheat supplies left by Russia and Ukraine.
We also know that 55 countries were dependent on the food coming from the Baltic region, and 55 is not a small number. So if you can't be standing along with another 55 looking for wheat supplies next year. So I think we have to be very watchful and careful.
Meteorologists say the severe weather is part of a reoccurring trend.
You notch the temperature up. So when you get these heat wave events, they're becoming more frequent, they're more intense, and when they happen, they last longer. So we're definitely seeing a shift in the trend to more intense heat waves happening in this part of the world.
The Indian Meteorological Department says heatwave conditions will continue in several regions in the next 5 days, but there's little respite expected afterwards, with May and June usually the hottest months of the year. Elizabeth Paranam, Al Jazeera, New Delhi.
Meanwhile, Pakistan's climate change minister says the country's gone straight from winter to summer without a spring season. Our correspondent, Kamal Haider, is in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, with more.
The threat to human life from what is happening because of the effects of global warming. Last year, Jacobabad saw a record temperature of 52 Celsius. That's over 126 Fahrenheit. And the doctors and medical experts warned that if this prolonged for a few hours more, it would lead to organ failure. So indeed, it is a dire crisis. The government has to come up with elaborate plans. Some of them are already in progress. These are projects that will take at least a few more years. That's hydropower. Basha Dam is under construction, and when Shahbaz Sharif took over as the new Prime Minister, one of the first places he visited was that Basha Dam. Pakistan is building dams, but that will take time. The other thing is that Pakistan has to wean off totally from coal because of the conflict in Ukraine. The prices of fuel have skyrocketed, and that is forcing many more countries in South Asia to start thinking about burning coal again. So that is definitely not an option. Now, the last government had started a very ambitious project, and one would hope that the new government will carry on with it, and that was massive tree plantation across the country.
A poor start to the rainy season in the Horn of Africa has added to fears the worst drought in decades could have catastrophic results. Across the region, 1 million people have left their homes and more than 3 million livestock have died. Harry Matassa reports from the Samburu region in northern Kenya.
Molusora Adano has been walking for hours. His animals need water, and he's finally found some. He says giving up wasn't an option. Herders in northern Kenya have lost thousands of animals because of recurring droughts.
I'm now always out here with the camels. Help doesn't reach us, but I know in the villages, at least, the government is giving people some water.
Parts of Kenya, Ethiopia and Somalia are suffering their driest conditions in more than 40 years. Harvests are ruined, animals are dying, more and more families are going hungry.
I used to have 250 camels. The drought has killed most of them. I only have 3 left. It's heartbreaking.
A fourth failed rainy season in the region is now a growing probability.
So if situations doesn't improve, we are going to see mass death of livestock. And when we talk about mass death of livestock, what that means is people's livelihoods are completely destroyed.
Assistance from aid agencies and Kenya's government is coming, but it's not enough.
Despite all these interventions, like social protection programs, buying of relief food by the government, issues to do with giving cash to vulnerable households, we still have a huge population in dire need of food aid who wish, if nothing is going to be done about it, will end up dying out of starvation.
The only way to survive for many is to keep moving. People here have been walking for days, looking for food and water for their animals. First, they were told there were supplies in that direction, about 100 kilometers away, but when they got there, they found nothing. Now they're heading towards the mountains, another 100 kilometers away, where some other farmers are gathering. It's a long journey, and when they eventually get there, there is no guarantee they will find what they're looking for. Haru Matassa, Al Jazeera, Northern Kenya.
To Haiti now, where violence on the streets of Port-au-Prince has claimed the lives of at least 20 people this week. Fighting between rival gangs in the capital began on Sunday, forcing thousands of people to flee their homes. Manuel Rapolo reports.
The sound of gunshots on the streets of Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince. At least 20 people have been killed over the past week alone, many of them caught in the crossfire of rival gangs.
My husband died and left me with 3 children. The situation is difficult for me. I don't know what to do.
Violence linked to gangs has forced thousands of residents to flee their neighborhoods. Many, like Marie-Diane Preville and her 3 children, say they're too afraid to return home.
I have seen many things, people dying and people walking around with heavy weapons. There's no one who can say anything.
This otherwise bustling street was quiet on Friday. Many businesses across the city have closed their doors. Gang violence in Port-au-Prince has worsened since the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse last July. Experts estimate that as many as 90 criminal gangs are actively operating in the city.
All I can tell is that Haiti is unlivable right now. You can't do anything. There's nothing happening. Businesses can't run. You can't even leave the city. First of all, the southern part of the city is occupied by gangs. Now the northern part is also occupied. So basically, we're locked in. We're under siege.
Authorities have deployed some 100 police units to patrol neighborhood streets. As government officials in Haiti continue to struggle to curb violence linked to criminal gangs, the concern now is over the growing number of residents being displaced by the worsening security situation. Manuel Rapalo, Al Jazeera.
Former 6-time Grand Slam tennis champion Boris Becker has been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison by a British court. The 54-year-old German was found guilty of hiding millions of dollars worth of assets to avoid paying his debts. Jonah Hull was at the court in London.
Boris Becker arrived at court for sentencing wearing a tie in the Wimbledon colours. He'd won the championship 3 times, among 6 Grand Slam titles in a tennis career that had earned him more than $50 million. Now, bankrupt and convicted on charges of concealing his assets from investigators, Becker would listen as Judge Deborah Taylor sentenced him to 2.5 years in prison. He must serve half of it before becoming eligible for release. "I accept the humiliation you have felt," she told him, "but you have shown no humility." The sporting legend turned coach and commentator has led a colourful life with vast earnings fueling a famously lavish lifestyle and then paying for a famously expensive divorce. Seldom far from the tabloid headlines, Becca fathered a daughter after a casual encounter with Russian model and waitress Angela Ermakova at a London restaurant in 1999. By his own evidence, child maintenance payments and disastrous financial mismanagement contributed to bankruptcy in June 2017. The court found that Becca kept spending and used deceit to hide what was left, more than $3 million in cash and assets. At trial, the jury had heard in his defence that Becca had relied on insolvency lawyers, signing papers he hadn't read and failing to understand his responsibilities. The jury instead found his actions deliberate and dishonest. It's not the first time Becca has had a brush with the law. In 2002, he was handed a 2.5-year suspended sentence for tax evasion in his native Germany. Here, in the country he now calls home, Boris Becker is going to jail. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Southwark Crown Court, London.
Now, the fight for equal rights goes on for one of Iraq's most persecuted minority groups. The Kauliya are Roman nomads who arrived centuries ago, but life for many of them now lies in ruins. Osama bin Javed reports from Diwaniyah in southern Iraq.
In the dusty village of Al-Zuhur, children have returned to school after a 14-year break. These are the Kauliya, or Roma people, scattered in isolated communities across Iraq. Nashwan says they face derogatory treatment and her children have no future after decades of persecution.
We were attacked with rockets. They don't want gypsies among them. People hate us. We don't have water. We have to buy water. Our houses are old and falling apart. I don't know why they deal with us like this. Aren't we human beings?
Most homes in the village are in disrepair and many are jobless. Khairi says he and his friends fought in the Iran-Iraq war and later alongside Iraqi forces in the battle against ISIL. He calls his community the living dead, and the Iraqi state just doesn't care.
The school, the clinic, and electricity. These were not provided by the government. UN agencies and NGOs provided these basics. And you're asking me about our future?
After the US invasion 19 years ago, aid from Saddam Hussein's government ended. Armed groups accused the Kauliya of being heretics and prostitutes and destroyed their village. No one dare says that on camera. They're afraid of the police. They guard the only entrance to the village and restrict access.
Yes, we used to have dancing and singing. We were visited by officials at that time. We were not living in poverty. Things are now upside down.
The government denies new ID cards discriminate against the Kauliya.
There was some issues with people and now they are more accepted than before. They are like others. They can apply for any job they like. But the unemployment and poverty rates are high in this province. It is true they do not have fresh tap water, but water is delivered to them by tankers.
But many villagers cannot afford to pay the daily water charge, though it's meant to be provided for free. Old videos of this village and its people show a different picture. Their ancestors, including performers, musicians and dancers, came to Iraq from India and other Middle Eastern countries more than 1,000 years ago. Now, the musical instruments have been replaced by pictures of clerics in their homes. And the singers have replaced happy songs with religious hymns of a tragic theme. The Roma people of Iraq say because of discrimination, they're excluded from a normal life and opportunities. And their question is that after generations have lived in this country, what can they do to be treated as equal Iraqi citizens? Osama bin Javed, Al Jazeera, Diwaniyah, southern Iraq.
Now, a tiny town in southern Brazil has decided to upstage its much bigger cousin, Rio de Janeiro, with one of the biggest statues of Jesus in the world. Officials in Encantado have built a much bigger version of Rio's famous Christ the Redeemer statue. Theirs is called Christ the Protector and stands 43 meters high compared to Rio's 38-meter tall sculpture. It opens to the public next year. Time for a quick check of the headlines here on Al Jazeera. Ukraine says Russia has intensified its offensive in the east. There's been fierce fighting in Donbass. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has described the situation there and in the city of Kharkiv as challenging, but says his forces are fighting back.
The situation in the Kharkiv region is difficult, but our troops and our intelligence have important tactical success. The occupiers are doing everything to destroy any life at the Donbass territory. Constant cruel bombardments, constant Russian strikes on infrastructure and residential areas state that Russia wants to make this territory uninhabited. That's why the defence of our land and our people is literally the fight of our life.
Russia's defense ministry has, for the first time, claimed to have used a submarine to launch missiles at Ukrainian targets. On Thursday, the UK's defense ministry warned that Moscow could still reach Ukrainian targets from the Black Sea. That's despite the sinking of its most prestigious warship, the Moskva, earlier this month. A powerful blast has hit a Sufi mosque in western Kabul during Friday prayers, killing at least 10 people and wounding many others. Sufis are a minority Sunni sect who follow a mystical branch of Islam. It's the latest in a series of attacks targeting places of worship and civilians during Ramadan. So far, no group has claimed responsibility, but ISIL has admitted to carrying out several attacks in recent days. An ISIL fighter responsible for the beheadings of several hostages has been sentenced to life in prison in the US. London-born Alexander Coty was part of the so-called Beatles group within ISIL. Hostages gave them the nickname because of their British accents. Coty pleaded guilty last year to murdering 4 Americans. A security guard at an Israeli settlement in the occupied West Bank has been shot and killed. The Israeli military say Palestinian gunmen opened fire in the Ariel settlement between Ramallah and Nablus and then fled the scene. All settlements are illegal under international law. An intense heat wave has hit India and Pakistan, with temperatures hitting record highs for this time of year. Parts of India have recorded 45 degrees Celsius, causing power cuts and straining health services. New Delhi reported its second hottest April in 72 years. So those were the headlines. The news continues here in Al Jazeera after Inside Story. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
The world is losing its trees. That's despite a decades-long effort to stop deforestation. A report says last year's goal of ending the practice by 2030 is now out of reach. So what's behind this destruction? And can it be stopped? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. A report by Global Forest Watch says the Earth lost a staggering 11.1 million hectares of forest last year. Wildfires fanned by global warming and human activities, such as logging and farming, are causing our forests to shrink ever further. The losses include nearly 4 million hectares of tropical rainforest, which are critical to capturing carbon dioxide. The rate of tropical deforestation last year was equivalent to 10 football pitches every single minute. All that despite a pledge by more than 140 countries to end and reverse deforestation by the year 2030. And while some have made progress, that deadline won't be met without a sharp decline in forest losses worldwide. Well, let's take a look at some of the other findings of this report. Tropical rainforest losses last year resulted in 2.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions. That's equivalent to India's annual fossil fuels emissions, and that's the world's third largest polluter. 40% of all tropical rainforest loss was in Brazil. Wildfires there were responsible for under a quarter of that. Most of it came from agriculture expansion and logging. And whilst global tropical forest loss slightly decreased in 2021, boreal forests in cold climates saw unprecedented losses. 6.5 million hectares were lost to wildfires in Russia alone. Well, let's bring in our guests now. And in the US state of North Carolina, we have Frances Seymour. She's Distinguished Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, which released this report. In Amsterdam, Wessel van Eden, a Global Communications Director at Just Dig It. That's an organisation working to regreen Africa. And in Oxford, UK, Michael Jacobs, an environmental economist at the University of Sheffield. A very warm welcome to all of you. Frances, you were involved in producing this report. It makes for pretty shocking reading. Are you surprised that we're still seeing this much deforestation across the world, some 2 decades after your organisation, the Global Forest Watch, started monitoring these forests?
You know, disappointed but not surprised. As you suggest, we do now have 20 full years of data from satellite imagery monitoring, and have seen just a steady, persistent, stubborn loss of forests at this level. You mentioned last year in 2021, more than 11 million hectares just in the tropics, and of that, 3.75 million hectares of the primary tropical forests, which are the most valuable from the point of view of carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation, indigenous peoples. So it's really a catastrophe. But really, for the last 20 years, that loss of humid tropical forest, primary forest, has hovered between 3 and 4 million hectares for 20 years now. So it's another step. I would also say that, in fact, the pledge to end forest loss by 2030 was made in November. So most of this loss had already occurred by the time of the pledge. So maybe we can see this as a baseline against which to judge performance against those pledges.
OK, we'll certainly look more at those pledges a little later in this discussion. Right now, I want to focus a little bit more on the impact of this deforestation. And Wessel, we've got 10 football pitches of virgin forest being lost every minute. I mean, my goodness, when I was a teenager, I'm going to age myself here, some sort of 20 to 30 years ago, these figures were being bandied around then. I remember football pitch size patches of rainforest being lost every single minute. It was shocking then. It's shocking now. What is the impact of this?
Yeah, the impact is devastating, as we all know. So I think, you know, we're in the midst of a global climate crisis, as I think, especially the panelists, but I think the majority of people are now aware. However, what it sometimes lacks is all the doom and gloom that's being portrayed, which is scientifically very true, does not lead to a lot of hope and inspiration for people to actually be able to do something. So what we as Just Dig It try to do is to really focus on solutions, nature-based solutions. And even though the numbers are devastating, again, no denying that, we do believe that regreening is possible and that there are a lot of things that we can do as humanity if we only have the will to do it together. It's not rocket science, but we need to do it now because the time to talk about climate change and deforestation is really over.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you are here to provide some sort of beacon of hope. I know you're very active in East Africa, and we will get more onto that a little bit later. But first of all, just keeping with the report, Indonesia, for example, is a success story in this report. It has reversed some of its deforestation. Why is that happening, Wessel, and how?
Well, I think due to the government really opening up to the fact that they have some natural resources which are really valuable, and that the more and more, luckily, people are starting to recognize these as assets and not as, natural resources alone, but really as economical assets to a country. So I think the example of Indonesia is a perfect example that, yes, we can turn the tide if there's only a will and also the legislation to back it up.
Michael, of course, this is a tenuous success in Indonesia. We've got to remember that there is always going to be pressure to reuse forested land. What sort of pressures does Indonesia face, and can it withstand it?
The pressures are huge, and they've just grown larger. We are now experiencing a very sharp rise in food prices, which, of course, is causing great difficulties for many poorer people around the world, but it increases the incentive for clearing land for agriculture. And in Indonesia, there has been a moratorium on new palm oil forests, plantations. Palm oil is one of Indonesia's principal exports, and it's something consumed in huge numbers of products, not just foods actually, but other products as well that use vegetable oils. And that moratorium has definitely contributed to the reduction in the rate of loss of Indonesia's rainforest. Remember, this is not an absolute decline or an absolute increase in forestry. It's a rate of loss which is slowing. That's good news. But with the ending of that moratorium and with very high food prices, you will see huge pressures to plant more trees, to take more land from virgin forest, to turn it into plantation land. And in other parts of the world, for example, Brazil, to grow crops which are more profitable than they were even last year. So the land pressures, which arise not just within those countries, but of course from our consumption. We in the northern countries are the major consumers of many of the things which come from those places, are huge. And that is why we have so much deforestation. The economic pressures are leading to it.
I mean, there has been quite a campaign, hasn't there, Michael, against palm oil, and I think most people are aware of it, if not aware of how widespread it is found in all our products. So why hasn't that caught on more?
Well, it's caught on a little bit, and one of the major successes of the last few years has been the number of multinational corporations, particularly northern ones, where there is some consumer pressure from consumers in northern countries, global north countries. So that has been a relative success story, but it isn't every company, and there are many companies that are not taking part in that attempt to reduce palm oil from deforested areas. The problem is that the pressures are huge, and when a product is very profitable, it becomes much harder to prevent farmers and landowners planting crops, cutting down trees, because they make so much money from doing so relative to the alternatives. And unfortunately, although it is absolutely true that forests are in themselves resources, in a global market, you're competing against the other things you could do with that land. And that's where high food prices will make things more difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, Francis, if we look at Brazil, for example, one of the main pressures there is agriculture, putting cattle onto the land, clearing it for beef, which is a huge commodity on the global market. The pressures that Jair Bolsonaro is under to create more money for his country are huge. And we see that reflected, don't we, in the amount of deforestation. So what can be done to stop that domestic pressure?
So I think comparing the Indonesia and Brazil cases over the last 20 years is quite illuminating in that their deforestation trajectories have diverged not once but twice, even though they face a common international environment. So you may recall that, in Brazil in the early years of this century, the Amazon was up in flames and had, historically high, unprecedented deforestation rates. And yet when the Lula administration came in and really mounted a whole of government approach to enforcing the law and providing incentives and disincentives to municipalities, to perform, and the Soy Traders Association imposed a voluntary moratorium on sourcing soy from recently deforested land. And the combination of all these things, including recognizing indigenous territories, establishing new protected areas, brought the rate of deforestation down by something like 80%, even while continuing an increase in the production of the main commodity drivers of deforestation, which then as now were beef and soy. And that success was maintained for about a decade, a dramatic reduction in deforestation rates. But then the political economy domestically changed, and since then, a lot of that success story has been unraveled in the last few years. And we've seen, I think just in the last year, an uptick of 9% in the part of the Brazilian Amazon that's being cleared for this commodity agriculture. But by contrast, in Indonesia, for the first 15 years of this century, we had a steady upward march of deforestation. And as has been suggested, that was due mostly to palm oil, but also clearing for fast-growing timber for the pulp and paper industry. But for me, the key factor in Indonesia was the catastrophic forest fires in 2015, which all Indonesians suddenly realized the cost of not protecting forests. Hundreds of thousands of people with respiratory disease, cost to the economy. And that's when the law enforcement, the moratorium enforcement, as well as these private sector commitments really kicked in.
But if you can't rely on the national leadership to take leadership in deforestation, where does the role of the international community come in, Francis? I mean, should we be using more of an incentives approach or even a punitive approach, such as sanctions?
I think it needs to be a mixture of carrots and sticks. And the question you've asked is right to the point in terms of how international cooperation is approached. I think at the outset, we need to recognize that a heavy-handed approach or an approach that could be interpreted correctly or incorrectly as protectionist in nature will have exactly the opposite effect that we might want. And we've seen again and again, a sort of national sovereignty protection response to heavy-handed impositions of restrictions, or worse, a reaction to, for example, putting into place domestic biofuel mandates as an alternative market for, in this case, palm oil, in case the European or other markets are closed. And so what we don't want to do is have the perverse effect. So in my view, a mix of carrots and sticks. For example, I think it's perfectly reasonable to work with the producer countries to close markets to illegally produced commodities. That's already been done for illegal timber. And now we're in the process of discussing how it can be done for commodities produced on illegally cleared land. But in addition, we need to provide carrots. And the one that we have an international framework for is performance-based finance for success in reducing emissions from deforestation. It's called REDD+. It's been agreed to under the Paris Agreement by up to 200 countries. And we really need to really up the finance, the positive reward for doing what countries can do, but need the incentive to do so.
Wesley, are you seeing any positive rewards in the areas where you're working? I mean, you're in East Africa, you're doing a lot to regreen those countries there, but also Gabon in this report was found to decrease its deforestation rates. It's been a success story. Are these countries being rewarded for their efforts?
Well, I think the countries, maybe not per se, but I think the communities, which in the end is where we believe the change really starts, is in the local communities, they're being rewarded. And to give you one example, we work a lot with agroforestry, which is basically focusing on smallhold farmers in Eastern, but now also expanding throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. Combining trees with crops is not only providing them with, more healthier soils, etc., but really providing with more crop yield. So by inspiring communities and helping them to realize sustainable agroforestry practices on their land, you will see that they're economically incentivized. And again, keep in mind there are over 350 million smallhold farmers in Sub-Saharan Africa. So can you imagine the potential impact if we are able to inspire and educate those communities to take better care of their lands in a more sustainable way, which does not only economically benefit them, but in the end will benefit all of us through carbon sequestration by combining trees with crops. So there are beautiful examples. And I think the communities benefiting in the end will make sure that the countries benefit as well.
Okay. Well, as we mentioned just a little earlier, 141 countries signed a declaration at the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow last year to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. Now, signatories agreed to promote sustainable trade and development that doesn't worsen deforestation and to increase investments in rural and indigenous communities to develop sustainable agriculture and forest management. But critics like Greenpeace say the pledge's 2030 goal effectively allows another decade of forest exploitation and is non-binding. Michael, Brazil was one of those 141 countries to sign this pledge, and yet we are seeing no sign of it halting deforestation. It's literally chopping down trees as it's signing away its promise not to do so. How much store do you lay in such pledges? How much optimism do you attach to them?
Well, it must be better to have the pledges than not to have them. There is no question that when countries sign declarations like this in public, and it was also companies and financiers who signed that declaration, they do come under some pressure, usually domestic pressure, but also international pressure, to abide by those pledges. But of course, that pressure may be much less than the pressures that they have internally, domestically. And in the case of Brazil and Bolsonaro, you get the feeling that, frankly, he signed that in order to make Brazil look good on the international stage, but had absolutely no intention of enacting it at home. But in other countries, those pledges do mean something. So it must be better to have them than not. But Greenpeace is right that in themselves, the pledges are not really enough. And we're seeing this, of course, in climate change action in every field. This is true in the general targets that countries and companies have got, and in specific energy targets and so on, which is that targets are the easy part. To say we will achieve something by 2030, or in many other areas 2050, is an easy thing for a politician or indeed a company to do. The hard thing is to enact the policies or the behavioural changes which make those targets realisable. And that's where we need to see much more action. So I'm happy that there are targets, but what you need to see are on the ground policies to make the targets achieved. And in particular, in the forestry field, it isn't just about the land use policies, it's about the enforcement of them. The difference between energy and forestry is that there are a rather small number of energy users, the big companies that produce most of the energy in the world, and you can regulate them and tax them and give them incentives, and they are part of an organised system of policy in most countries. Deforestation occurs through thousands and thousands of landowners and people who use other people's land, and it occurs over massive areas. The very size of the areas that we're talking about, the size of the UK every year deforested, just gives you an idea of how difficult it is to enforce the law, let alone where there has been no law. This is also about enforcement, and that's where much more money and effort needs to go.
And also, I suppose, where organisations like Wessels, Just Dig It, come in, because they are on the ground working with those local communities at the very grassroots level. Wessel, do you think that there is enough organisations like yours working throughout the world?
Well, there's never enough to begin with. No, I think there can be more. And I think one important thing to add is here, because we're talking about legislation and government pressure and regulations, and I completely agree that, it's very difficult. It's easier when it comes to the energy sector because there's a limited amount of players and you can put, laws on them and make them behave accordingly. But I think when it comes to restoration, because it's not only about conservation, but really restoration is what Just Dig It is all about. Communication is so important. And again, like I said previously, not only the doom and gloom part where we state the facts, like, the amount of deforestation that's going on. We need to keep doing that. It's very important. But also people tend to react better to hope and inspirational stories. So what Just Dig It is trying to do, not only in Africa, but especially focused on Europe and Africa, is just to tell the stories of how relatively simple, and again, relatively it is, to regreen enormous plots of land. Low cost, low tech, going back to the roots of farming where we used to come from, and not this intense meat-producing farming, but really looking at, agroforestry and the potential of the smallhold farmers. And we really believe positive storytelling goes a long way. So we work with a lot of partners who help us in kind to tell that story. And what we see is there's so much young people, especially, reacting to that, getting a lot of positive energy from, at least there is a part of a solution. And we're not here to say, this is the solution, we're all rally behind what Just Dig It is doing. But what we do see is that people are in dire need of positive stories when it comes to climate change. And yes, we should keep legislating the big polluters, but positive storytelling is really something that goes a long way.
Well, I completely take your point and agree with you, but unfortunately I am going to have to go back to the biggest doom and gloom aspect of this report at the moment, because it's a crucial bit that we haven't touched on yet. And Francis, is that the Amazon rainforest is almost at tipping point. Now, this I found incredibly scary. What does it mean to be at tipping point? Because it also says that if this happens, it blows out of the water all efforts to contain global warming. Can you expand a little bit more on that for us?
Certainly. So the idea of a tipping point is that at a certain degree of tree cover loss in a forest ecosystem like the Amazon, that one can get into a positive feedback loop in which continuing deforestation leads to warmer and drier conditions, which makes the forest more vulnerable to fire, which in turn releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, leading to warmer and drier conditions and more vulnerability to fire, and so on. And scientists have been warning about the possibility of a tipping point in the Amazon rainforest for quite a number of years now, in which if we pass that point, the entire rainforest ecosystem would be converted into a grassland savanna. And if that happened, all of the carbon that's currently contained in the vegetation, which some of the most carbon dense as well as biodiverse places on the planet, would be released up into the atmosphere. And that's what would blow the Paris Agreement targets out of the water. And unfortunately, the latest science is showing that that tipping point may be closer than we had originally understood, and that it's being driven, not only by the global warming and climate change to which all emissions contribute, but also the local deforestation causes warmer conditions. It dries up the rainfall such that the whole thing could tip more quickly than we thought.
Michael, what's your thought on this just briefly in the last minute that we have left? Are we going to reach that tipping point?
I defer to the scientists on this, but as Francis says, they are warning that these points are much closer than they used to be, and that is unsurprising because of the trends in deforestation. And it teaches us a really important lesson, which is that the Earth is not something that you can simply plunder on a linear scale and say, well, in the end, if we lose all the trees, we lose the trees, because what you lose are whole ecosystems and the climatic balance that those ecosystems have created. We live in a world that we did not create, and we are totally dependent on that world, the natural world, for regulating the life conditions in which human societies live. And that's a really profound lesson, which human societies used to understand, and actually the people who live in the rainforests tend to understand that. They have lived in harmony with their natural environments for a very long time. And it's, of course, industrial societies, starting in the north of the world, which have tended to regard the natural environment as something to be exploited rather than to be lived within and as part of. And that is a very profound economic lesson that we all need to learn, and we need to learn it very rapidly, or else, as Francis says, we may hit those tipping points, and then we really do not know how catastrophic that could be.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope that this programme helps people take that on board and that we do learn it and we don't reach that tipping point. Thank you very much to all of you for joining our discussion today. Francis Seymour, Wessel van Eden and Michael Jacobs. And thank you too for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.
Talk to Al Jazeera. We ask.
What is the timetable in your mind? When do you think that Europe can be off of Russian gas?
We listen.
When I've seen and played football with these refugees, I look at them and they're happy, they're smiling.
We meet with global newsmakers and talk about the stories that matter on Al Jazeera.
The latest news as it breaks.
With Ramadan, Easter and Passover all happening right now, tensions in this city and its holy sites are set to remain high.
With detailed coverage.
This used to be a cultural center. It will take weeks before all this rubble is removed.
From around the world.
825 million books were sold around the world. We're talking about paper books.
Short films of hope and inspiration. A series of short personal stories that highlight the human triumph against the odds. Al Jazeera selects.
Revealing eco-friendly solutions to combat threats to our planet on Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Darren Jordan in Doha with a quick reminder of the top stories here on Al Jazeera. Ukraine says Russia has intensified its offensive in the east. There's been fierce fighting in the Donbas region. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has described the situation there and in the city of Kharkiv as challenging, but says his forces are fighting back.
The situation in the Kharkiv region is difficult, but our troops and our intelligence have important tactical success. The occupiers are doing everything to destroy any life at the Donbas territory. Constant cruel bombardments, constant Russian strikes on infrastructure and residential areas state that Russia wants to make this territory uninhabited. That's why the defence of our land and our people is literally the fight of our life.
Meanwhile, Kyiv's mayor is warning another Russian attack on Ukraine's capital could be just hours or days away. And staff with UN Chief Antonio Guterres say he came dangerously close to a missile strike while on his first visit to the country since the start of the war. He's now left Ukraine. Oda Abdelhamid went to the site of Thursday's attack.
You can see behind me the rescue workers and the repair, the emergency service are actually sifting through the rubble. Now, earlier this morning, they did find the body of a young woman. She was a journalist with Radio Liberty. She was buried under this rubble somewhere here in this apartment block, and we are really in the city center of Kyiv. Now, this attack happened just after President Zelensky had wrapped up his meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The first reaction really came because of that missile attack here in downtown Kyiv, with many members of his government and President Zelensky himself again underlying the fact that Russia did not have any respect, in their view, even towards the UN Secretary General, and making a point that this attack was done purposely and was very well timed to coincide with his visit. A lot of criticism ahead of his visit, not only because of the timing and the way he decided to go to Moscow first and come back here, but also because of the role of the UN so far. There's been a lot of frustrations in the weeks leading to the war, and there's been a lot of frustration throughout the war. We're 2 months in, many other leaders have showed up here in Kyiv, and then he comes at the back of it. So certainly a difficult position for the Secretary General, who is trying now to just push forward the humanitarian track.
A powerful blast has hit a Sufi mosque in western Kabul during Friday prayers, killing at least 10 people and wounding many others. Sufis are a minority Sunni sect who follow a mystical branch of Islam. It's the latest in a series of attacks targeting places of worship and civilians during Ramadan. So far, no group has yet claimed responsibility, but ISIL has admitted to carrying out several attacks in recent days. An ISIL fighter responsible for the beheadings of several hostages has been sentenced to life in prison in the US. London-born Alexander Coty was part of the so-called Beatles group within ISIL. Hostages gave them the nickname because of their British accents. Coty pleaded guilty last year to murdering 4 Americans. A security guard at an Israeli settlement in the occupied West Bank has been shot and killed. The Israeli military say Palestinian gunmen opened fire in the Ariel settlement between Ramallah and Nablus and then fled the scene. Israeli forces are now leading combined operations with the army and police in pursuit of the gunmen. All settlements are illegal under international law. An intense heat wave has hit India and Pakistan, with temperatures hitting record highs for this time of year. Parts of India have recorded 45 degrees Celsius, causing power cuts and straining health services. New Delhi reported its second hottest April in 72 years. And a tiny town in southern Brazil has built one of the largest statues of Jesus in the world. Officials in Encandlando call it Christ the Protector. It stands 43 metres high compared to Rio de Janeiro's Christ the Redeemer, which is only 38 metres. It opens to the public next year. Well, those are the headlines. The news continues here on Al Jazeera after The People versus Agent Orange. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
J'ai vu l'avion passer et derrière lui, c'était comme un nuage. Et puis après, c'était tout mon corps était trempé d'une certaine poutre assez gluante. Et je commençais à tousser. Je ne savais pas que cette poutre qui m'a recouverte, c'est un poison. Je suis née pendant la guerre, je vis dans la guerre et maintenant aussi on est en guerre.
These helicopters flying over the ridge, spraying something, and they didn't even see the kids. The kids were all fishing or just playing by the river, and the kids were all choking and gasping. That night they were all really sick. They had diarrhea, they were having trouble breathing. We went down to the river that next day, and that's when we found dead ducklings and dead crayfish, dead trout. We called the Forest Service, and they said, oh no, it's perfectly safe. It was a mixture of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, Agent Orange. It was banned in Vietnam, and nobody realized that the same chemicals were being used here. And it's still going on.
Agent Orange was a tremendously destructive component of a tremendously destructive war. In its own unique way, Agent Orange was the most destructive instance of chemical warfare in modern history.
When I was still 5 years old or something, I read everything. It was still during the war, and I read something about all the birds being killed by oil spills from ships being blown up. And that's what I worried about during the war, was all those birds. You coming, Mike? Gonna help me? And I started writing letters. I'm not sure who I sent them to, or wanting someone to take care of those birds, please. Maybe that was the beginning of my activism. I have no idea. We moved here in '74. The kids were just part of this landscape. You know, they were down along the river. They knew everything that lived down there. My kids loved it. I mean, they were part of it. There were beavers and otters in the river then, too. And, of course, all the fish and the herons and ospreys. And so they just were part of that. They loved it. There was nothing to worry about. Clear cutting is one of the most insane things you could ever do. It's like strip mining a living organism, which a forest is. They weren't required to replant, And most of those clear cuts developed into huge brush fields. Then all of a sudden they're faced with this law that says you can't clear cut unless you replant within 3 years. So then they had to clear all the brush on these old clear cuts so they could replant them. It just all coincided with the end of the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. Michael Newton from Oregon State University was getting surplus barrels of Agent Orange that the